consulting with districts across Indiana and the country on using data to improve student achievement. I've stood in support of many of the changes and reforms that have been made in Indiana. I stand in support of transparency and increased accountability. There are many good points in the proposed rule. But as you can see, based on the comments today, there's work left to be done. The school year is more than half over, and schools are being required by the department to submit data based on current state and federal rules, without the opportunity to change the data that they are submitting based upon rules that are proposed or may happen. The proposed rule process is being advanced without schools having the knowledge of the impact of the proposed legislative changes, as mentioned today in House Bill 321 and 324, or the department's request in the USDOE's decision on Indiana's AYP waiver request. Both the USDOE's decision and legislative changes may require additional changes to the proposed rule. For example, current rules for Public Law 221 requires, for accountability purposes, that the student be in attendance 126 days, and for federal accountability, 162 days. The department's waiver request had a 162-day limit. Current rules limit alternative testing for federal accountability. Public Law 221 accountability does not have any limits on alternative testing, nor does the waiver request submitted to the USDOE. I believe there must be a balance between the urgency for improving student achievement and fairness to teachers and principals that deserve to understand the rules before a school year begins. The proposed rule moves from a performance plus improvement model to a performance plus growth model. As there needs to be transparency and accountability, there needs to be transparency in how the growth model works. A performance gap will always exist between the policy of the state board and the department and the understanding of this policy by teachers and principals without transparency. The rules have already been established for performance-based pay, and those policy decisions have been made. And they too take into account growth model data. And schools that I work with are asking, and have been asking for over a year. A year ago we met with West Bruce and voiced our concerns. And they're asking, what data is the department going to provide to schools so schools don't have to spend an extraordinary amount of time determining growth data on a teacher basis? The department has been unable to provide that data. Therefore, that performance gap exists between the policy at the state board level and the department and it being implemented and what teachers perceive that policy to be in the classroom. They don't understand the rules. One reason, there are a couple reasons that they're asking. One is if you look at the growth model, that's a 3-point system. High growth, normal growth, low growth. Performance-based pay is a 4-point system. So the question is being asked, how's the department going to translate that data to schools, and how's the teacher's pay going to be impacted as you translate between a 3-point model and a 4-point model? The other reason that they're asking is because they don't feel that there has been transparency in the explanation of how the Indiana growth model works or the Colorado growth model. So a year ago when we met with West Bruce, we brought examples of data from a teacher that received 2 students in the same peer group. So they scored the same score the previous year on ISTEP. That teacher took those two students the exact same distance, increased their score to, say, 550, both of them. Under the Indiana growth model, that teacher could have one student showing high growth and one student showing low growth. The department has consistently talked about the Indiana growth model and the peer group, when in fact it relies on multiple years of data. And that's why you get different ratings. So a teacher can take a student she receives, grow them the same distance on the standardized test, but receive a different rating relative to high growth or low growth. And again, I think teachers deserve that transparency and the explanation of how the growth model works. I do believe that we've got a good start, but there's work left to be done. I think there needs to be transparency in the process. And as many others said, I do not think it's fair to change the rules in the middle of the game. And any proposed rules should not go into effect for this school year. Thank you.
Alan Kaufman.
Well, good afternoon now. Thank you all for being willing to skip your lunch to listen to testimony. I'm not a superintendent. I'm not a principal. I'm not a teacher. I'm not hired by the school corporation or any association in the state of Indiana that deals with education. My kids are both out of the public school system. So I don't have a direct dog in the fight. However, a lot of good friends of mine are teachers. From the city of Goshen, 32,000. I think that our school superintendent, Dr. Bruce Staley, was recently selected as Superintendent of the Year in Indiana. I have friends who are principals in our school system. In fact, we have one principal who is in the school that has the highest mobility rate in the city of Goshen. I think it's in the 80% range. He's got the highest percent of free and reduced lunch. He's got the highest percentage of non-English speakers in his school. He's worshipped by his students. He's worshipped by his teachers. He's assembled a great group of teachers that collaborate well, and he's worshipped by the parents. Yet, he skates on the line of the accountability standards whereby a principal would have to be removed from a school if the school doesn't meet the improvement standards. I've told you who I'm not. I am the mayor of the city of Goshen. I'm in my 15th year. And I've watched the effect of the accountability on our city, and I draw the connection between this and economic development when I think about the misperception of the quality of education. I have no quarrel with whether or not we need to improve our schools. No matter how good we are, we can improve. I'm not here to argue about how you assign an A through an F, but I do have questions about that also. Our school superintendent didn't come today partly because he was given the impression that this decision has already been made. I share the concern that a couple other people have about who's not in the room today. I do wish Dr. Bennett was here. If the rest of the board members do not listen to this testimony or do not read the testimony, shame on them. I woke up this morning thinking, do I really want to come down? I got up at 5:30 this morning. I mislaid my iPhone somewhere, so I'm completely out of touch with Goshen. I don't know how I functioned before cell phones. Drove through some driving rain, some awful weather for over 3 hours to be here because people accuse me of being a little bit like Don Quixote and tilting against the windmills. So I guess maybe I'm here to do that today. Good schools are part of the quality of life in a community. It's one of the things that everybody looks at when deciding whether to move to a community, whether that's business coming to the community or whether that's residents deciding whether to live in their community. I remember when Governor Daniels first came into office, I don't remember if it was in his first State of the State address or some other address, but he said that in his administration, all departments would be tasked with doing everything they do, keeping economic development at the top of the agenda. Now, I realize Dr. Bennett wasn't appointed by the governor. He was elected, so he doesn't have to meet that test. But when he stood up a year or so ago and announced to the world that 40% of our schools deserve a D or an F, I think he failed the test on economic development, because I think that that sends a horrible message to the world. I was in our auditorium at Goshen High School when Dr. Bennett came and talked to our teachers. And he apologized for what was perceived as painting teachers with a broad brush and saying they're all horrible teachers, when that wasn't the fact. But I also heard him say that when we went to the growth model to measure our schools, it showed that they weren't doing as bad as they were perceived to be doing before. So I went up to him afterwards, and I said, Dr. Bennett, when I was in college, my areas of concentration were biology and chemistry. And in those, we do a lot of experimentation. And I see you as experimenting with education right now. When we did experiments, we changed one variable at a time. If changing the variable about going to a growth model showed that we weren't doing as bad a job, why did everything else have to change at the same time? And he paused and gave me what I think was a less than satisfactory answer, when he only said that there were other things that needed to change too. And he didn't say what they were. Now, I think the way we show what our schools are doing is an injustice to any diverse school corporation, any urban school corporation, and I'd like to use Goshen Schools as an example, although I realize all urban areas could paint a similar picture to a different degree. I had two kids that went to Goshen Schools. One was a National Merit Scholar. One was on an individual education plan, diagnosed in the 3rd grade as on the autism spectrum with Asperger's syndrome. He graduated from Goshen High School actually with a better grade point average than his National Merit Scholar brother, who didn't care about his grades. But Lucas is now a 2nd year at Manchester College, and he's doing okay in college. So I have two kids on very different points of the spectrum at Goshen Schools, and they were both served very, very well by Goshen Schools. Goshen Schools is one of the few school systems currently offering the International Baccalaureate program. There are seven high schools, 6 public school systems in Elkhart County, 7 high schools, one has 2, and 3 Christian high schools. And of all those schools, Goshen, with some regularity, has more than half of the National Merit Scholars in Elkhart County. It's hard to say that the school system is not performing well. But those teacher friends of mine who are doing great jobs, my principal friend, or my superintendent friend, Dr. Staley, I hear the frustration in their voice when they talk about the changes that are coming to education. And I see them hanging on, even though some of them are retirement age, staying in the system because they are concerned about what's coming to their compatriots that are coming up behind them. They're not encouraging their kids to go into education. And I see that as an injustice to all of us, because we need the best and brightest people in education, and it doesn't help when we tell our superintendents and our teachers that they're overpaid, that they have to work harder when they're going to be in a failed system, in a D or an F school. Why is any college student that's coming out as a teacher, why is the brightest and best going to come to a D or an F school when they could go to an A or B and not have to work as hard? So I have a concern. Our school doesn't give up on anybody. Our principal, Jim Kirkton at the high school, and one of the assistant principals, Phil Lederock, wrote a book called School of One, and I would encourage everybody on the Board of Education to get a copy of that book. They would probably give them a copy and read it. We don't give up on anybody. We have a bigger concern about parents and kids giving up on themselves. But we constantly hear from our health system, from companies in our community, when they are recruiting management people to our community, to work in our community, that they don't choose to live in Goshen because of the perception that Goshen Schools does not do well as the suburban, all-white, less diverse school corporations. They don't take the effort to drill down and look at the disaggregate scores and compare those with the suburban schools. All they look is the aggregate scores. I think it's an injustice that that's the easiest data that we put in front of people. But people sit out in Oregon and they look at this information and they think that they're not going to get educated in Goshen schools. Now, I'll draw a parallel with what the governor has said recently about right to work. He said when we get companies' butts in the seats in Indiana, we win 2 out of 3. When our school corporation can get past people looking at aggregate I-STEP scores, or now you're going to lay a D or an F in front of them too, if they can get past that, they can get them to go to Goshen schools, unless people just don't want to go to school with minorities or they don't want to go to school with poor people. And there's nothing that I can do about that. But I would hope that we would not continue to give a misperception about the quality of our education and people not make choices to live in a community because they believe that a different school system is better than ours. We have neighboring school systems that encourage non-English speakers to come to Goshen Community Schools. I have a teacher friend that had his disabled son come to our schools because he felt they would get a better education. And you know what? They do get a better education at Goshen schools. And so to some degree, we're a victim of our own success in dealing with all of these issues. But if we would lay out the data so it's easier for people to see, so that if I have a non-label kid or if I have a special needs kid, I'm looking at that category. I'm not looking at some misperception about the quality of education. I, too, would ask you, the Board of Education, to table this. I'm glad that the gentleman from Martinsville, the principal and the city council member, said that he was a Republican. I happen to be a Democrat, and I didn't hear him say anything that differentiated about how I feel about what we're doing here. I am glad that the member of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce is still in the room, because I think the Indiana Chamber of Commerce and the Indiana Economic Development Commission need to be involved with the Department of Education and understand the relationship to economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. Russ Simnick.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the staff for taking their time to listen to everybody today through this long hearing, and particularly to Board Member Blacketer for her lengthy rainy drive this morning coming down. You know, there are a lot of familiar faces in this room today, but the one thing that just struck me on my way up here is that the unfamiliar part of this is that we're all on the same page on the same issue, that we all have some serious concerns with this accountability model. The Indiana Public Charter Schools Association stands for clear, transparent, accurate accountability. We support a model that fully informs parents as to the quality of their school so they can make an informed decision, especially in this climate of education choice. Unfortunately, while this current proposal strives for that same goal, we believe it falls short in a few key areas. And these concerns are not specific to charter schools. You've already heard from Derek at the Chamber, who proposed a plan that we fully support. The Mind Trust will be sending a letter with similar concerns. Stand for Children will be coming a little bit later to provide their testimony. Let me be clear. Charter schools want the highest levels of accountability, and we welcome the promise of transparency and clarity that the A to F letter grades promise. When this process began, we fully supported a model that was based on growth, specifically the Colorado Growth Model. However, as the process unfolded, we became concerned that this model relied too little on growth. We believe that the heavy reliance on initial proficiency and the under-reliance on growth will lead parents to draw incorrect conclusions about the quality of their schools. Nearly 2 years ago, I withdrew my 2 daughters from a private school that will always be an A school on this model, and I enrolled them in a charter school, which will probably never be much better than a C school. Did I make the wrong decision? I believe not. I'm able to look at the data, understand it, disaggregate it, drill it down, and find the right school for my children. Unfortunately, this model will lead a lot of parents to draw a complete opposite conclusion. We have always contended that charter schools have the highest levels of accountability. The Center for Education Reform released a study in December 2011 stating that 15% of all charter schools ever opened have been closed for failing to make the cut academically. In Indiana, by the end of this school year, 8% of Indiana charter schools will have been closed. This is true even though Indiana has some of the highest barriers to entry in the country for opening up new charter schools, with 4 out of 5 applicants ever being submitted rejected. We embrace accountability. With the small number of schools we have to, because one bad school makes the whole movement look bad. With this commitment to accountability, we have 3 concerns with the rule. First, while we support the Colorado Growth Model, we do not believe this model goes far enough with growth. The Colorado Growth Model puts students into peer groups based on performance and measures growth on how those students do against each other. While this seems to make sense, it fails in that it does not hold schools accountable towards moving these students towards proficiency. We believe that every school should be measured for how it does in getting every student to proficiency. Regardless of how charters may or may not perform on this measure, we believe it's the right thing to do. Our second concern is with the heavy reliance on initial performance. Most charter schools locate intentionally in areas of high need. This rule, unfortunately, by its reliance on initial proficiency, would discourage new schools from opening in high need areas and encourage existing schools to start recruiting accomplished students in order to boost their initial proficiency. This is an unintended consequence of this model that we just can't have. The University of Indianapolis released a study in 2009 that showed that the typical charter school enrolls students 16 points behind their traditional school peers. By making this initial proficiency so strong in the model, it establishes a pattern that a typical high proficiency, low growth school will struggle to make it down to a C school, while a charter school or other school that has high growth but starts at initially low levels will struggle to ever make it up to a C school. As a parent, one of my children might actually do better in a high growth, low proficiency school, but this parent will never be able to discern, but most parents will never be able to discern which school is best for their children. Finally, we believe this model does not provide parents with an easy to understand method of calculating school grades. I would have a hard time explaining to the average parent that, quote, 1 point shall be added if at least 36.2% of the top 75% of students achieved a growth level that is equal to or greater to the 66th percentile of the student's peer group. And that's just one bump that you can get, and there are others very much like that. For these reasons, we want to thank the board for their work, and we want to urge them to embrace the good parts, and there are many good parts in this proposal. We want to increase the role of growth. We want to hold schools accountable for getting all students to proficiency in a short time frame. To that end, and I was so happy to hear the Chamber of Commerce's proposal this morning, we fully endorse that, and we'll engage and work fully with the department if they're interested in working towards a model that mirrors that. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Little.
Good afternoon. I thank you for your diligence in listening to all of us today. It's an important process, and we value the process. My name is Tom Little, and I have the honor of serving 15,000 children in the Perry Township School Corporation here in Indianapolis, and it is indeed an honor to serve those children. I'm here today to talk about Perry Township. I'm here today to talk about our residents and our community members. I'm here to talk about our staff. I'm here to talk about our kids, because we're concerned. When the initial A through F program was installed, we understand the reason why we went to that direction. We understand the need for greater transparency. We also need to understand that we believe it's a system that parents can understand. Parents can relate to an F. They can relate to an A. And we understand the rationale for that. We may not agree with it, but we understand the rationale. So we're not here to debate that today. We also are concerned that the system that initially was implemented has flaws, deep flaws. Perry Township was, with the initial system, was given a D rating, which caused tidal waves through my entire school district. It concerned my staff, it concerned my parents, it concerned my community members. In the age where we're trying to attract the best and the brightest to our school corporation, we're trying to attract the best and the brightest businesses to our school corporation, a D rating doesn't make it, especially if it's unfairly labeled. A D rating in a school corporation in which 9 of the schools received an A rating. A D rating to a school corporation in which the schools received 2 B ratings, 3 C ratings, and 3 D ratings. By any accounts, that doesn't add up to a D school corporation. And that's how parents relate to it. And that's how community members relate to it. They understand it's a complex formula, but they also understand there's an averaging in grades. If you're going to reduce something to that level of a grade, you need to simplify the process. 80% of our kids who were administered the test showed improvement. We've received numerous rewards. In fact, Henry Burkhardt Elementary School received a Blue Ribbon School Award this year. Southport Elementary, a Distinguished Title I School. Abraham Lincoln Elementary, INSAE Top Gainer Award for 5 years, and high schools received National AP Honor Roll Awards. The school district is a great school district. From 2011 testing data, 80.5% of our kids demonstrated improvement. 78.9% of our kids tested passed both math and language arts, ECA assessments. From 2006 through 2011, the district graduation rate increased from 72.9%. This year, we are over 88% graduation rate, not a D school corporation. I guess my biggest concern is I've gone to legislators and I've talked to representatives of DOE, and they've sat down and spent hours working with us and talking with us, and I appreciate that and I thank them for that. My concern is, what does the new formula do to Perry Township? No one can answer that question. What kind of district grades are we going to receive? No one can answer that question. But yet I've been assured that a new formula and a new system will address those issues. I've been assured that, Tom, you're not going to be a district rated D at this point in time because of the new formula system, that we've built in some changes. But no one's been able to tell me, using the criteria from last year's test data, no one has been able to tell me what effect that will have on the school district. My question to the State Board of Education is, why would you pass a new formula? Why would you pass a new ruling when you have no idea what impact it will have on the school districts in the state of Indiana? That's my question. And I ask them and I implore them to reconsider passing such a formula that they don't know really what effect it will have on the school corporation. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Cynthia Roach.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Cynthia Roach. I'm with Indianapolis Public Schools. I'm the Supervisor of Research Evaluation and Assessment. My concerns over this are many, but first I want to point out IPS, our mobility rate is 69%. 69%. And our free and reduced lunch, I do not have that exact number, I believe it is around 80%. Those are very high numbers. We educate the most struggling population within the state, obviously. My concerns with this start with deducting points. The first thing that struck me was deducting points if fewer than 90% of the lowest performing students participate in the test. Participation deduction. In the past, it's always been you have to have at least 95% of students participating, and quite honestly, we test our kids. We test our kids. We test our kids. Our elementaries have 99% of the participation. Many of our elementaries have 100% participation. Our middle schools have 96% participation, which is, again, excellent. However, when you are dealing with your most struggling populations, schools with most struggling populations of students also have the most difficulty getting these students to attend school, much less getting them to attend when they know a test is to be given. While IPS staff do an amazing job to make sure students do participate, this requirement appears to be specifically aimed at penalizing schools who are attempting to educate the most struggling students. A mobility rate, again, of 69%. Others have talked about what these kids are dealing with at home. Getting them to come to school is a struggle, period. Getting them to come to school during a test is harder. But we get them there. I mean, we get them there. But when you're suddenly focusing on those lowest performing students and losing points for that, you're setting them up for failure. Setting such a high cut for just the initial points to be awarded across the board concerns me. Schools showing growth will be at risk of this growth being recognized if they struggle to get enough students in attendance during the test. They're going to lose points for participation, yet they definitely overall have kids coming and they are showing growth. While the criteria states that only students enrolled for 162 days will be counted, if participation is counted on the total population as it currently is for AYP, then the struggling schools with the most transient populations and struggling students will be penalized and unable to accurately show the successes they are attaining. So that's a question. What are you going to base that on? And there are too many ways to lose points and too few ways to gain points. The only ways to gain points at the moment are based on a bell curve. Give me a break. There is nothing. What about these schools who are getting the kids in the door? What about giving them an extra point for 99 to 100% participation? Yet there are many ways to lose points for participation. It's not just the overall, that's one of them, but this 25% criteria, the bottom 25%, and then there's another one which I can't quite make heads or tails out of. There are 3 ways to lose points, only 2 to gain. Actually 4 if you throw in the low performance. The high school method is complicated at best. When I tried, I too have been attempting, I live in numbers, that is my thing. I love numbers. Playing with spreadsheets all day is my favorite thing in the world. I have been attempting to come up with the same estimates of what this would look like to IPS had these rules been applied, and I'm still getting there. But at the moment, the best I can tell for two of our high schools who were capped at a C, who were on the takeover list, but they made such high growth, they were capped at a C because they didn't make AYP. Had they not made AYP, I think one would have been an A, the other would have been a B. They were capped at a C. As far as I can tell under this new method, they would both be Fs. The grad rate starts at such a high percentage to receive any points. Both of these schools have been, if you look at their grad rate over years, their trend lines are beautiful. They're marching right up at nice steps, marching right up. This past year, they marched right up again. They are showing that growth. Yet your grad rate requires no points until 60%. And for the next 3 years, it doesn't even take into account the 5-year grad rates. Our students, while we may not get them there in 4 years right away, we get them there in 5. I've been tracking it. It's there. It's a beautiful thing. We get our kids through school. Penalizing our students, our most transient students, our students with such a low SES students for the waiver, penalizing them because they struggle with testing, and so you're going to ding them because they got a waiver to get that diploma. You're going to ding them because they got a general diploma versus a Core 40 diploma. It's wrong. It's just wrong. The model just seems to be set up to penalize the students in the most struggling populations. And one last thing. I urge you, you've got to include rescores. Absolutely have to include rescores. If you are going to continue to include criterion items, or constructed response items, you've got to continue to include rescores. Even with back reads, errors occur. I worked for the Department of Education for 8.5 years. I worked on ISTEP for 8.5 years, and I know errors happen. Even with the back reads, even on the old GQE, which had 2 reads, and if the scores didn't match, it went to a 3rd read. Errors happen. We always get a handful of kids back with rescores where the scores go up. And it's not always by just 1 point. We've seen huge jumps. And sometimes those huge jumps for just a couple kids, it's enough to make a difference for a school making AYP or not making AYP, and where they fall on the PL 221. So I urge you to not do away with rescores. It's got to be there, and it's got to be an automatic inclusion into the calculation. It can't be something that's dependent upon an appeal. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda Erlinger.
Hello, and thank you again for being patient. It's long morning and afternoon. My name is Linda Erlinger, and I'm the Executive Director of Stand for Children here in Indiana. We thank you to the State Board of Education for providing us this opportunity. Stand for Children's mission is to ensure that every student graduates high school prepared for and with access to college. From our vantage point, any accountability system must meet at least 3 goals. It has to be easy to understand, particularly for teachers and parents. Ease of understanding will enable parents and teachers to set performance expectations for each and every student and work together to hold each other accountable for reaching those individualized expectations. It must provide accountability for all students. The model should set high growth targets for each student, with the end goal being college or career readiness. Each student should be expected to grow over time to grade level, and for those already at grade level, maintain or grow beyond grade level. It must encourage schools to effectively serve students who are academically behind. The system must not provide unintended incentives for schools to simply attract and serve students who are already performing adequately or close to adequate. As more and more schools of choice emerge, districts going to all choice like Indianapolis's Lawrence Townships, elementary schools, magnet schools, public charter schools, and private schools, it's really important that an incentive system and the accountability model encourage schools to serve and hold high expectations for all students. Our analysis suggests the proposed model has many strengths, especially in the high school model. We support the multidimensional yet focused elements of the high school model, namely that it includes student performance and improvement on end-of-course assessments throughout a student's time in high school, student performance and improvement in the school's 4-year and 5-year graduation rates, and especially that it includes indicators of college and career readiness, although we would encourage the board to accelerate the model's relative emphasis on college and career readiness indicators so that much more than 10% of a school's final grade is based on these indicators in the first year. The proposed high school model will encourage schools to focus on graduating students in a timely manner, encourage schools to not give up on students who it may take an extra year to graduate college and career ready, encourage students to be proficient on the end-of-course assessments at or before grade 10, yet allowing students to demonstrate proficiency on these tests before graduation, and requiring schools to focus for the first time on ensuring that students don't just graduate, but graduate with some indication that they are prepared for post-high school work. We would, however, encourage the board to revisit and set higher the expectation that only 25% of the high school graduates graduate high school with one of these readiness indicators. There are some areas of the elementary and middle school model we would encourage the board to take a close look at it as it deliberates a final model, particularly in 2 areas. First, as proposed, the model does not give clear performance expectations for individual students. School principals, classroom teachers, and parents would greatly benefit from a system that gives exact growth targets a student must meet. Imagine a system that at the beginning of the school year, growth expectations were provided for each student to achieve to make sure that they were on track and on a path to graduate. Our state could set individual growth targets for students who are behind so that they get to proficiency within 2 or 3 years. To students who are already proficient, that they meet at least average growth, and extra credit growth targets that would take a student to pass plus over time. The percentage of students at a school who meet individual growth targets could form an accountability system for elementary and middle school students. Such a system would first be easy to understand for parents, teachers, and the public. Second, would set high expectations for each and every student. And third, would set higher growth expectations for every student who is academically behind, setting the expectation that average growth for students who are behind isn't enough for them. A second area we would encourage the board to carefully consider is doing everything it can to ensure that a model does not discourage schools to serve traditionally hard-to-serve students. Indiana is home to a growing number of schools of choice. As currently proposed, the model focuses heavily on student proficiency, the percentage of students passing ISTEP Plus, with students' growth being essentially a bonus system. An unintended consequence of such a model is that it may encourage the growing number of schools of choice to place less emphasis on targeting and serving hard-to-serve students. Another unintended consequence would be discouraging new school providers from starting their work or coming to Indiana, particularly if their mission is to serve underserved students. A system that sets growth targets for every student, including higher targets for students who are behind so that they can get to proficiency within a few years, is a stronger method of providing the right incentives for schools to serve all students well and continue to position Indiana as a state that welcomes innovation and self-initiative among our talented teachers and school leaders. We welcome the opportunity to work with the board and Department of Education to make some modifications to the proposed model, and we applaud the strong first step the board and department have made in revamping Indiana's accountability system. Thank you.
Wes Barners. Wes Barners. Marissa Graham.
Thank you so much. My name is Marissa Graham, and I'm a kindergarten teacher in Anderson, Indiana. I have to say, after hearing the testimony of a wide range of people today, I do feel very thankful to them, and I also feel hopeful because we seem to all be on the same page here, regardless of our background, but all coming from the education profession. So I have to believe that you're going to take that message back to the State Board of Education and Dr. Tony Bennett and make the changes that we all find necessary for our great state. I have to say I don't understand why we're considering changing a grading system right now that, quite frankly, educators, let alone parents and community members, are just now becoming familiar with. That tends to cause chaos and frustration, and that never leads to a positive effect for any of us, whether you be a teacher, a business, a school district. So I question why we're doing it now. I also have to say that using one norm-referenced data point seems a bit archaic. All of the educators know that we have to judge our students in our school on more than one piece of data. Because one test can't possibly show what the complex job that we have and how our students are growing and learning and changing every day. And I'll just give a couple quick examples. I have a student, Jessica, who came to me, try not to get emotional, not as an English learner, not knowing one letter of the alphabet, and just recently, before winter break, she could read her one-sentence letter, phonetically spelled, to Santa. So she's not going to make the grade. She's not going to make an A. And our school, because we serve a certain clientele, we serve nearly 90% of children who live below the poverty level. We're not going to make that grade, but we're doing an amazing job. And that leads me to another thought, that I can't quite comprehend why my state legislators and my state superintendent of instruction and my state school board or school of public instruction and of education would not be making a system that cheers all of the amazing things that I do and we do every day in our classrooms. I can't understand how we think a system that's going to label, for sure, 34%, as I understand it, as failures, how we think that's going to better us as a state, better me as an educator, better my student, Jessica, by calling her an F. It's not. And I can't say that I really agreed with or agree with the current labeling from A to F, but I most definitely oppose the new changes to this model. This is a system that is a one-size-fits-all, and educators know that doesn't work when you're dealing with children. We can't control our product. They're children. So while we do believe in teacher and student accountability, and are huge advocates of that, and that we're using data for constant improvement of our instruction every day, we test, that's another story. We don't believe this is in any effort to raise student achievement or better the quality of instruction or better me as an educator. So I guess I have my thoughts on what's behind it, but it's not in an effort to raise achievement. I can't understand shortening the length of time that we have to make improvement is the right move either. As I stated, we're working with children from a variety of backgrounds, special needs, languages, etc., and shortening the time we have to push them to where they need to be is really ensuring that the state can take over at a much more rapid rate. And I think what we need to say and call it, many have today, is privatization. It isn't fair, it isn't right, And no, I'm not a big company, and I don't have a lot of money, obviously, because I chose the education profession. This isn't the change that we need to make to help our students. What we do want is a transparent, fair chance to show the amazing improvement that our children are making. We want a State Board of Ed, a superintendent of education. We want parents and community members that respect our profession and the complex, hard job that we do. Guess what? You have the ability to set that tone and to make that happen, to make us attractive and to cheer us on. I ask that you consider that. I ask that you most definitely wait on these changes to the current labeling system, continue to take input, and use the expertise of the people here today to make a system that is fair and transparent. Myself, as a public school educator in the Indiana Federation of Teachers, opposes this new legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank Bush.
Well, good afternoon, at least halfway through the afternoon. I'm Frank Bush, Indiana School Board Association. I had three different alternatives from the standpoint of presenting testimony on the AF accountability, and it appears to me in hearing all the previous testimony that I chose the proper one and the one I think that school boards would most appreciate having the state board relate to regarding where this process is going and what we're doing. And fundamentally, what our position is that there are too many unanswered questions to implement this rule as it's been proposed. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this and keep in perspective that the best thing for the state board to do is to just back off. Slow down and have a lot more analysis taken. It sounds like to me that what we're picking up from the standpoint of around the state, there are a lot of individuals that are confused, do not understand the overall intent, and do not know where we're going. So one question I feel like needs to be answered by the state board and the state superintendent is fundamentally, has the AYP waiver been accepted? Now I know it's in process, and I know what the answer is right now. But I can almost assure the state board, if we have to go under the auspices of having the AYP implement a new system, the way it has been so onerous in helping us not implement our old system, it's going to be just unconscionable to say that we're trying to do anything on behalf of students the direction that we're going. What's the impact of the application of grades to school performance on local schools? It appears to me, from the standpoint as I've talked to school board members about this, there's a need for clarification on local impacts. In other words, what you've already heard testimony about this afternoon and this morning. How are we going to fall in line, and what impact is it going to have on our school corporation? So we, as elected officials and appointed officials in a governing structure of a school corporation, can communicate to the public why our schools are being rated the way they're being rated. And they need to be able to do that so they can devise ways to have the ratings improve if need be. What is the state board's intent to grade schools? That seems almost just fundamental, doesn't it? Should have been answered a long time ago. Seems like a lot of individuals are beginning to question what the real intent is, what it's all about. I don't think there's any indictments being given. I think they're just questioning why we're going through all this, considering the overall aspects of what's going on. Is it to make judging schools' successes simpler and fairer, or complex and challenging? Why are we grading? Are we trying to communicate something that's simpler and fair? I think we need to focus on that in some ways. Have the metrics been reworked to fairly rank an elementary and middle school combination or a middle school and high school combination? The answer to that might be yes. I don't think it's been communicated very well out in the field as to how those impacts have been adjusted. And maybe they haven't been either. That's why it hasn't been communicated. Will the grades be used to judge school corporations? Now, for the School Boards Association, for school corporations, this is fairly meaningful. If so, it will be meaningless since all buildings' grades have already been established. With statistical purity, it appears as if no school corporation could ever obtain an A unless all buildings were A with little slippage to B+ or higher. And that's been foisted out as another possible issue that could have to be related to. We need to have some answers on that. And lastly, is the State Board of Education amenable? And I change that again and say it in this way. Are they willing to re-examine the standards for placement in the AF categories? I know a lot of work's gone into this. I know a lot of discussion and a lot of time. But it just appears from the standpoint of an observer and someone dealing with public education on an integral level that's not far enough along yet from the standpoint of being able to communicate to the publics exactly what the overall results are going to be. There needs to be more realistic performance standards included than just testing scores for English and mathematics. In summary, public schools meet the needs of students in multiple ways and should be given credit for the various approaches to educating each child, not categorized with two standards or a few standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Heather Brooks. Heather Brooks. I'm going to apologize in advance on this last name. Lisa Bowden Distal? That's correct. You did great.
I want to thank you. I know everybody's probably getting pretty tired at this point. I just want to tell you a story about a middle school, an awesome middle school in southeastern Indiana, a school with a teaching staff which works hard to embrace the needs of their students, a school which opens its doors to every child regardless of their limitations, home support, cognitive abilities, behavioral and emotional delays. A school that educates 686 students, which changes daily because of mobility, in a rural tri-state area with 83% of all 7th grade students passing language arts, which is well above the average of 77%. A school that educates 8th graders who pass language arts, and 76% of those students pass, beating the state average, which is 72%. The same group of students in 7th grade math scored 85% passing score, above the 75% state average. Our 8th graders fell short of their target in math with 73% passing average and the state average being 77%. We recognize we need to work in that area. But did you know that those teachers at this school were torn between 8th grade standards, which contradict the requirements in high school preparation for math in the math curriculum? Math ISTEP scores across the state were lower, especially in the area of special education. Many schools adopted pre-algebra books for 8th graders due to the state expectation of preparing students for 9th grade algebra. However, the core standards and those standards for algebra and what we were teaching did not align with ISTEP. Teachers are torn on what to do. Prepare your students for high school, or do we teach what is going to be on ISTEP? I know it's hard to believe, but this school is made up of more than just ISTEP scores. I'd like to share some of the student and staff achievements that you probably don't know about this school. Reading is an integral part of our curriculum. Screening is completed at the beginning of the school year, and we struggle with students coming in to middle school with almost 50% of our students not at grade level. We have a literacy program, and we see 70% of those students showing significant improvements last year through our reading program. Those scores aren't necessarily reflected on an ISTEP test. Computer keyboarding programs in order to prepare our children for completion of tasks in college and in the workplace. We have students that enter those programs with only 10% of them having accuracy of 80%, and by the end of the time that they spend in those classes, 90% of them are reaching the target. This rural tri-state school has a competitive academic team whose members are accustomed to bringing home first, second, and third place ribbons. If they come home without a ribbon, they're disappointed. Doesn't happen very often. This school has increased honor roll counts from 34 to 41% and has also increased their straight A honor roll as well. This school has expulsion and suspension rates which fall much below the state average as determined, and the students work to keep, the staff works to keep the students in school. The school also helps pursue talents in areas such as Project Lead the Way, which provides high school credit for students and prepares them for career choices in the future. The same school is achieving a 94% attendance rate, which does not quite meet the state target, but we are getting better with that. Last year we were at a 91% at the end of the year. This school has trained teachers in research-based instruction and requires all special education students reading below grade level to participate in this program. Students are responding positively to this program, but substantial growth for this population takes time and consistency. The Receiving High School trained staff this year so that in future years students in this program can continue their growth in the area of literacy. This school provides a structured remediation program during the day to target specific educational needs of students. 40 students participated this year with intensive small group instruction. Since 2007, students taking Core 40 exams have steadily increased passing rates from 68. Now these are 8th graders going into high school that I'm talking about here. 68.4% to 98% in 2010. That's about 105 students that we're talking about yearly that test in this area. Students from the school are typically ranked in the top 25th percentile or better, often among the top 1% in these national core exams. I am proud to state that the school I am identifying here is Sunman Dearborn Middle School in St. Leon, Indiana. As principal of this magnificent school, I am both disappointed and just a little bit appalled that we have been rated a D school. I do not find that the criteria that's being looked at defines our school or says a whole lot about it. It doesn't tell parents much about our school. I ask you, does this school really fit a category of a needs improvement? It is my belief that this system is archaic and is being used to label schools unfairly as we are attempting to educate a diverse population in the 21st century. Lastly, I would just like to make a couple of statements about maybe some things that you should look at. Recognizing all growth for students, whether it be low, high, with equality and fairness. Shifting the focus of criterion-based data, not limiting options for schools to demonstrate student growth. We have a lot of data in our buildings. We could easily demonstrate to you that our students are growing and they are learning. It isn't just an ISTEP score that will tell you that. In fact, with many of our students, you're testing computer skills with ISTEP. You're not, even when we're looking at reading comprehension, we're not really testing reading comprehension. I implore you to broaden the scope beyond language, arts, and math as you look at grading our schools. And I know that each and every one of you, you've dedicated your time here today and in everything that you do because you care about kids. And I know that we are all touched whether we have our own children or we have nieces or nephews, if we're grandparents, if we just have friends that have children. We're all touched by children, and they are our future. And I would ask that you take the hands of the people that educate students and that you be cheerleaders for them. Because you folks are in the position to do that. And I tell you, it would mean so much to our teachers to be cheered on instead of beaten down. I thank you for your time and for your patience today.
Thank you. Pat Rogan.
Dr. Rogan is the dean at School of Education at IPY, and she had to go to a meeting, and she left a short written statement and asked if you would allow it. I would just read it into the record, and is that all right?
Okay, and you can also just submit the written document. It has the same weight than if it's read.
Well, I'll read it for the record if you will allow it. Okay, Dr. Rogan writes, while I fully support reasonable accountability measures, it does not make sense to structure a state accountability system that uses statistical quotas and a bell curve that ensures only 34% of students in elementary and middle schools would be considered high growth. Why would our state statistically limit high growth students? Conversely, this norm reference system would not reflect significant improvement made by schools in a given year because it mandates 34% will be labeled as low growth. Also, why would average growth students in this model be excluded from a reward category? Given the very high stakes as a consequence of low school letter grades, i.e. state intervention, Indiana must ensure a fair system is established. If you use current data in this faulty accountability proposal, Indiana would have 20% of its students graded as D and F. This compares to 7% of Florida schools, even though Indiana schools score better on the National Assessment for Educational Progress tests. If this system is adopted, I can imagine a future where no school will want to serve students with IEPs, students learning English, and other high-risk students. I urge you to use criterion-based measures to assess student growth and success. As you know, PL 221 states that grading categories should be based on improvement. Thank you, and forgive me, I was reading that for the first time for Dr. Rogan.
Thank you. Cindy Ball. Cindy Ball. I'm going to check and see if we have any other folks signed in. With everyone having spoken that signed up, this concludes our public hearing on 11-51 performance categories.